So today I want to go over a tornado werewolf build for the Druid that is completely built around speed farming. So if you're someone that's trying to farm experience to get to level 100, you're still trying to farm out gear, or you're even trying to farm out glyph levels, this is going to be one of the best builds in the game for Druids. And I have been seeing a lot of people trying to push higher nightmare dungeons when it really doesn't make sense, because going above say 50 or 60 nightmare dungeon keys is really only for the challenge. It becomes much more tedious and much less effective than doing mid-tier nightmare dungeons, doing a speed farming build, and progressing much faster. Now for this version of the build, you are going to want two different uniques, but you only really need Tempest Roar to make this build work, a lucky hit for storm skills to grant you 4 spirit, and your base storm skills are now also werewolf skills. But for the speed farming version of this build, I'm also using Mad Wolf's Glee, which werewolf is now your true form, and you gain +2 ranks to all werewolf skills. Now for speed running, this is pretty good. It's much less tanky, but it gives you move speed, gives you more damage with the plus ranks, and is overall just going to be much better for more mid-tier nightmare dungeons and more mid-tier endgame content. If you're trying to push higher nightmare dungeons, or you find yourself not being super tanky, or if you don't have this unique, just use any chest piece with a lot of damage reduction. This is the old chest piece I have right here, a lot of damage reduction, and just put the aspect to get damage reduction while in werewolf form. And then next up we have our skill tree, which I have done a little bit of changes to for this version of the build. So we're using Storm Strike primarily for damage reduction and for the odd points where you do need a little bit of spirit regeneration. We're generally not using this a lot. That's why we're only putting 1 upgrade into it. So Storm Chance now has a chance to immobilize. This is just to get lower down in the tree. Getting other upgrades for this doesn't really make sense because we don't actually use it that much. Then we're going over to Tornado. The main thing this build is focused around, putting 5 points into this. Tornado's incredibly strong because it's an AoE effect. It stays out for a little bit, constantly dealing damage to everything in an area, and we can just have dozens of these out at a time, and they're proccing ridiculous amounts of additional effects. Upgrade 1 has a chance to spawn an additional tornado whenever we cast Tornado, and upgrade 2 tornadoes have a chance for enemies to become vulnerable. And since we're going to have so many tornadoes out and they're all constantly dealing damage, we'll apply vulnerable through this if enemies survive quite a lot. Then we're going down to our defensives. Cyclone Armor for non-physical damage reduction. When you use it, it knocks enemies back. Upgrade 1 causes enemies to be slowed when they're knocked back. Upgrade 2, which is the primary reason we're using this for a speedrunning build, is you gain damage reduction every 10 seconds. And this ability is also good when you have enemies surrounding you and you're trying to move past them. You can pop this, knocks everything back, slows them. Very good for moving around the map much more quickly. Then we're going down, taking Blood Howl. It's just a big heal. Upgrade 1 reduces the cooldown by 1 second every time you kill something. Upgrade 2 gives us increased attack speed, and we're going to want to be using this on cooldown primarily for the attack speed buff, and we're going to be able to have this up quite a lot of the time. Then we're going down, we're taking Hurricane, which is just a big AoE effect that constantly damages enemies near you and applies a lot of different effects. Upgrade 1 slows enemies, upgrade 2 causes enemies to deal less damage. Then we're going down and taking our ultimate, Grizzly Rage. One of the main things this build is focused around, gives us massive damage increases, one of our main damage scalars, and upgrade 1 causes us to be unstoppable while it's active, so it's our only unstoppable. Upgrade 2, we fortify for 8% of our base life per second while it's active, and this is our only fortify generator as well. But with how much we're in this, we're basically fortified 100% of the time anyway. Then for our capstone, we're taking Earthern Might. Damaging enemies with earth skills has up to a 5% chance to both restore all of your spirit and cause all of your attacks to be crits for 5 seconds. The chances increase to 10% for crits and if hitting a stunned, immobilized, or knocked back enemy. And because of one of our aspects, this works with our storm skills. And this doesn't have an internal cooldown, so you can re-proc it while it's active. So when it procs, it makes all of our attacks crits, which then increases the chance of further procs of this. So you can actually proc this back to back. And then next up we have our passives. 1 into Heart of the Wild to get Wild Impulses. Your core skills deal more damage but cost more spirit. And keep in mind, most of these passives are multiplicative, so the damage increases are much more massive than they look. Then 3 into Predatory Instinct. Increased critical strike chance against close enemies. This is good because usually the things that are going to survive are going to come in close range with you, such as bosses or bigger elites, so this will help kill them faster. Then increased movement speed while in werewolf. With how this build works, if you have movement speed rolls on a few your gear pieces, we will have capped movement speed, and this will help do that. Then we have 1 and 2 Ancestral Fortitude to get Vigilance, damage reduction for 6 seconds after using a defensive skill. Since Bloodhowl has the cooldown reduction off kills, we'll have this up quite a lot of the time. Then we're going down 3 into Nature's Reach, deal increased damage to distant enemies, doubled if the enemy is CC'd. And because of this being a speed farming build, a lot of the time we want to spawn tornadoes, run past the enemies, have the tornadoes finish them off, so this will have this increased range damage proc. Then we're going down 1 and 2 Elemental Exposure. Lucky hit, your storm skills can make enemies vulnerable. We already have a lot of vulnerable, so this is primarily to get these other points. 3 into Endless Tempest, increase the duration of Hurricane. Hurricane is mainly there to proc a lot of other effects. It does some decent damage itself, but primarily we want to active as long as possible to proc other damaging effects or damage reduction. Then 3 in a Bad Omen, a lucky hit up to a 30% chance when damaging a vulnerable, immobilized, or stunned enemy to spawning Lightning Bolt that does some decent damage. This is the base damage of this proc, so this damage proc is actually quite a bit. Then we're going down, putting 1 into Neurotoxin. Poison enemies are slowed, which basically all enemies are going to be poisoned by us, so this can proc a bunch of other effects, only need 1 point. 3 into Envenom, poison enemies take 30% additional critical strike damage, again multiplicative, so that's massive. And then you want 3 on your necklace to get up to 60%. This is probably one of the biggest damage increases for a passive skill in the entirety of the game. Then 1 into Toxic Claws, critical strikes with your werewolf skills, apply a poison over time. We don't care about the poison damage, we just want enemies poisoned to proc a bunch of additional effects, such as Envenom. Then we're going down 3 into Defiance, nature skills deal more damage to elites. 1 into Circle of Life, when we use a skill that costs Spirit, we heal ourselves. This is primarily to get Resonance. Nature skills deal 6% increased damage, and this is a somewhat low damage increase. It still is multiplicative, but we really don't have anywhere else to put 3 additional points that are going to be more useful than this. Then we have our Spirit Boons. They're exactly as you would expect. Wariness for damage reduction to elites, swooping attacks for attack speed increase so we can cast more tornadoes, Calamity to extend the duration of ultimate skills by 25% because Grizzly Rage is a massive part of this build, Masochistic, critical strikes with shape-shifting skills, heals you for 3% of your max life. This is our main heal, and we do so many crits that this will heal us for crazy amounts. Then Calm Before the Storm, a lucky hit, nature skills have up to a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate by 2 seconds, again because Grizzly Rage is such a massive part of our build. And then next up we have our Paragon Boards, and like with all my other builds, we're primarily going to be going over our glyph and board selection, but there'll be a link in the description to a build planner if you want to follow the boards point by point. It's just much easier to do it that way. So the glyph for our first board, we're using Werewolf, increased damage while in Werewolf, and then secondary is reduced damage taken while in Werewolf, and we're in Werewolf 100% of the time with this version of the build. Then the first board you're going to want to take is Ancestral Guidance. After spending 75 Spirit, you deal 30% increased multiplicative damage for 5 seconds. So just a really big damage increase that's up a lot of the time, but if you're a lower level, you're going to want your first board to be Lust for Carnage. Critical strikes with werewolf skills restore 2 Spirit. And because of how much our tornadoes are hitting, and because of Hurricane, this can restore you a lot of Spirit, so if you're lower level, take this first. Then the glyph on the first board is Exploit Glyph. When an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. This can happen once every 20 seconds per enemy, so this will cause anytime we hit an enemy, they instantly become vulnerable, which is very good for burst damage and incredibly strong for speedrunning builds. Then you also get some increased vulnerable damage, but we primarily want the secondary effect on this glyph. And you actually just want to get 25 dexterity or as close to that as you can get, because the primary scaling of this glyph, so the increased vulnerable damage, is actually really low compared to other glyphs. Then we're going up and taking the Thunderstruck board. Storm skills deal 30% increased multiplicative critical strike damage against vulnerable or immobilized enemies, so another massive damage increase. Then we're taking the Earth and Sky glyph, which gives a bonus to all magic nodes within range, and the secondary effect is nature skills deal multiplicative increased damage to crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. Now what's really nice about this glyph is that the increased bonus to magic nodes also affects the increase to stats. So with this glyph fully maxed out, if I put 1 point into one of the magic dexterity nodes here, I get 17 dexterity. Now that's really good to get the secondary effect of a lot of the rare nodes throughout the board. So for instance, this node down here that gives us a bunch of poison resistance, I can get this because I put that 1 point in increased dexterity, and the same for a lot of the other rare nodes within the board. So if you're needing more dexterity or more intelligence, you can move around some points and put points into the rare nodes in this glyph, and you'll get a pretty big increase for a low amount of points. And then you're going to want all the other magic nodes within range. Increased storm damage, damage reduction for vulnerable enemies, always really good. Then we're taking constricting tendrils. We're not taking the legendary node, but we're putting in the spirit glyph, increase critical strike damage with core skills, then critical strikes increase the damage enemies take from you by 2% up to 12% multiplicative. And I have put some more points into this so we get more critical strike damage with core skills. Then we're going back down to our ancestral guidance node, going over to the right. We're taking lust for carnage, critical strikes with werewolf skills restore to spirit, but like I mentioned, if you're low level, take this board first. Then the glyph we're using is Undaunted, one of the best glyphs I think for druids. Massively increased damage while fortified, we're always fortified, then damage reduction while fortified. So just massive buffs all the time. Then finally we're going down, we're taking the heightened malice node. While 3 or more enemies are poisoned near you, deal 45% increased multiplicative damage. This is one of the highest damage legendary nodes in the entirety of the game. So again, if you're lower level, you would want to take this as a secondary. So you would take Lust for Carnage first, then you would take Heightened Malice second. And then we have our uniques and our legendary aspects. We already went over the Tempest Roar Helmet, which is required, and Mad Wolf's Glee, which isn't required, but is better for the speed running version of this build. Then on our necklace, one of the main aspects is Grizzly Rage now turns you into a dire werewolf, giving you move speed instead of damage reduction, but the main part is you get up to 75% spirit cost reduction. Now with our spirit regeneration from a bunch of our other effects, we only need to put this legendary aspect on our necklace. We don't need to use a two-handed weapon and use this aspect. 75% reduction is enough to basically have infinite spirit while in Grizzly Rage. Then core skills deal up to 40% increase in multiplicative damage based on your fortify. We're fortified almost 100% of our life for basically 100% of the time. So just a massive damage increase. And again, this is multiplicative, so it's pretty massive. Then increase the duration of Grizzly Rage, and Grizzly Rage crits increase your critical strike damage by 10%. This is stacking. And I don't know the cap on this. I have heard that the cap is 1000% increased critical strike damage, but this is one of the biggest damage scaling effects in the entirety of the build. This is also why Grizzly Rage is such a massive part of the build. Then on our gloves, tornadoes seek up to 3 targets. This will make tornadoes have some sort of tracking so they actually go to enemies to damage them instead of just randomly move around. Then on our weapon, which we are using a one-hander, critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed by up to 25% for 5 seconds. While in combat, this is procced 100% of the time. We want more attack speed because we can use more tornadoes the better our attack speed is. Then on our offhand, the Earthen Might key passive also applies to your storm skills. So this is our capstone that's a lucky hit that'll proc and restore our spirit, give us all critical strikes. This is required for this capstone to work in this build. Then on our legs, we have Disobedience, percentage increased armor stacking, one of the best defensive aspects in the game, used in basically every build. And then another change up is on our boots. While Hurricane is active, gain +2 ranks to your shape-shifting skills. So this is really good because when you use Hurricane, it's also going to buff up all of our other skills, giving us a damage buff, proccing a bunch of effects, making enemies deal less damage. When we pop Hurricane, we're basically getting buffed in every way imaginable. Now we were using the legendary aspect that gives us increased movement speed while unstoppable, so while in Grizzly Rage, and you can freely move through enemies. Now the reason we changed is because we're already movement speed capped, which is 200%, so we don't need the movement speed. The moving through enemies is good, but for a speedrunning build, I think this increased damage is going to be a bit better. And then we have our gems and gear stats. On our weapons, we want critical strike increase to vulnerable enemies. In our gear, we want damage reduction while fortified. In our jewelry, we want increased armor. Now you can't change the stats on uniques, but if you don't have this chest piece, just get all damage reduction on your chest piece, and then get the damage reduction while in werewolf as your aspect. And this is going to be basically the same for the legs, but damage reduction from distant enemies, damage reduction while fortified, damage reduction from poison, max health, total armor, anything that's going to make you tanky, get it on your chest piece. And same thing for our legs, damage reduction from distant, damage reduction from poison enemies, damage reduction while fortified, damage reduction. Anything that makes you tanky, get them on your legs as well. Then on our boots, you're going to want move speed, that's your main roll, total armor while in werewolf, damage reduction while injured, and then dodge change. And you're going to want a decently rolled movement speed because with how this build is set up, if you have good rolls on say your legs and your necklace for movement speed, you will be movement speed capped. And then for our gloves, this is one of the main pieces of gear I can upgrade. Lucky hit chance, critical strike chance, and attack speed are your best rolls, but you also want increased ranks to tornado, which I don't have. That would be a pretty big damage increase. Then on our weapon, vulnerable damage, core skill damage, willpower. Damage to close enemies does help, but I think maybe a critical strike damage roll or something like that could be a little bit better than the damage to close enemies. But this is still a very well rolled weapon, and you definitely want a one-handed axe for this version of the build because a massive damage increase to healthy enemies is very good for speed running builds. Then on our offhand, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, cooldown reduction, damage reduction while fortified, basically the best rolls you can get. You can also get spirit cost reduction, which could be a good roll, maybe over something like cooldown reduction. Then on our necklace, movement speed, damage reduction while fortified, ranks to envenom. I do have werewolf skill damage, which is decent, but there are some other rolls that are better. I think you can get vulnerable on your necklace, or you can get damage reduction while poisoned, which would also be a pretty good roll for this. The main rolls are going to be the envenom passive and movement speed. Then on our rings, you want maximum life, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, and damage to vulnerable. I don't have damage to vulnerable on either of my rings, but lightning damage and damage to slowed, both are still going to be pretty good damage increases, but vulnerable is overall going to be better. But that's pretty much the entirety of this build. Now, like I mentioned, this is specifically focused around speed farming. You're not going to be pushing in the Lilith with this build. You're not going to be pushing really high nightmare dungeons. This is for doing mid-tier nightmare dungeons, 50 to 60, somewhere in that range, doing them as quickly as possible, which is going to be the best way in the game to farm experience, to farm loot, and to level up your glyphs. Going super high nightmare dungeon runs is not efficient for anything. The only reason you're going 70 plus nightmare dungeons is for the challenge. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.